I ended the last video by talking about the body's physical response to stressors. In this video, I'll talk more about our cognitive and behavioral responses. As we'll soon see, though, these responses are all linked, each being able to shape the other. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Nemo, you might remember that two of the main characters, Dory and Marlin, often respond very differently to stressful situations. Dory always tends to look on the bright side. For example, when she meets a big scary whale, she isn't at all concerned about being eaten. She's just excited by the opportunity to potentially make a new friend. Marlin, on the other hand, has much more negative reactions to potentially threatening situations, always interpreting them in the worst possible way. Stated differently, Dory and Marlin often have two very different cognitive appraisals of the same event. A cognitive appraisal is simply a person's subjective interpretation of a situation. And, as the example with Dory and Marlin illustrates, not all of us interpret events in the same way. For example, imagine getting ready to take a big exam in an important class that you need to graduate. What thoughts are running through your mind as you approach taking the exam? Are you worried about the potential negative consequences if you don't do well? Or do you relish the challenge of mastering new, interesting material? It turns out that these different interpretations can have important effects not only for our emotions, but also for our physical health as well. Remember that in the previous video, I defined a stressor as something that we perceive as being potentially demanding or threatening. And this word perceive is important. If we perceive something as a threat, this not only causes the negative emotional state of feeling stressed out, but also triggers a physical reaction by our sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis, as we saw in the last video. And certainly, some events, like encountering a poisonous snake or hearing the fire alarm go off in the middle of the night, might very rightly be interpreted as potentially threatening, in which case our fight or flight response will give our bodies the boost of energy it needs to effectively deal with the situation. However, just because something might be difficult doesn't necessarily mean it must be interpreted as threatening. Specifically, appraisal theory, developed by Richard Lazarus, proposes that when people encounter a potential stressor, they can interpret it in one of two different ways. First, people could make a threat appraisal of the situation. That is, they see the situation as a potential for some kind of harm or loss. This type of cognitive appraisal usually results in feelings of distress. Remember, this is the bad kind of stress. However, this same stressor can often be reinterpreted not as a threat, but as an opportunity for personal growth, what we would call a challenge appraisal. Although the situation might still be stressful and demanding, with a challenge appraisal, the person is focused on the potential positive outcomes rather than the negative ones. This type of appraisal usually results in eustress. Remember, eustress is the good kind of stress, and positive emotions such as excitement and enthusiasm. As a concrete example, imagine that you have to give a big presentation for one of your classes. You could see the presentation as something that will expose your flaws, cause you embarrassment, and potentially sink your grade in the course. This would be considered a threat appraisal. But you could also interpret that same situation as an opportunity to help you improve your skills, showcase your abilities, and gain recognition. This would be considered a challenge appraisal. This process of cognitively labeling a potential stressor as either a threat or a challenge is called primary appraisal, and it's actually the first step in a two-step process. If the person labels the situation as a challenge, then the process ends. However, if the person labels the situation as a threat, then that person moves on to the next step in the process called secondary appraisal. In secondary appraisal, the person evaluates whether or not he or she has the necessary resources to cope with the stressful, threatening situation. Going back to our example with giving a big presentation, the person may interpret it as a threat, but nonetheless believe that they can effectively cope by adequately practicing and preparing. This would be experienced as a relatively low-threat situation. However, if the person does not think they can effectively cope, for example, perhaps they believe that they are a hopeless public speaker and no amount of preparation will do, then this would be experienced as a high-threat situation. As I hinted at earlier, these different cognitive appraisals can actually change our body's physical response to a perceived stressor. For example, one famous study had participants complete something called the Trier Social Stress Test. In the Trier Social Stress Test, participants have to give a 5-minute speech to an evaluative panel that has been instructed not to give any kind of positive nonverbal feedback, such as smiling or nodding. Next, Participants have to perform a difficult math exercise under time pressure in front of the same panel. I think most of us would find this situation to be a little bit stressful. Importantly, however, the researchers found that participants made different cognitive appraisals of this event, and those different appraisals affected both their emotions and their physiology. Some participants interpreted the task as a threat. That is, they focused on the potential for harm that might come from doing poorly on the speech and math exercise. But other participants interpreted that same task as more of a challenge. Instead of focusing on the potential for harm, these participants instead focused on opportunities for growth. These participants not only reported feeling less stressed out by the event, but their cortisol levels were also lower than participants who interpreted that same event as a threat. So, perceiving stressors as a challenge versus a threat can actually downregulate our HPA axis response, which can have beneficial health effects in the long run. Another way that we can help our physical and emotional well-being in stressful situations is by using appropriate coping strategies. These are the thoughts and behaviors people use to actually respond to a potential stressor. There are many different types of coping strategies, but researchers usually group them into two general categories: problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping involves direct attempts to manage or control the stressor. For example, if you're worried about a big upcoming exam, problem-focused coping might include things like going to the instructor's office hours, seeking out a tutor, or putting together a study group with fellow classmates. Unsurprisingly, people are more likely to engage in these kinds of problem-focused coping strategies when they perceive they have some amount of control over the event. Emotion-focused coping, on the other hand, involves attempts to manage one's negative emotional reactions to the stressor. For example, reinterpreting a stressor as a challenge instead of a threat would be an emotion-focused coping strategy. Other emotion-focused strategies might include things like journaling or exercising. Unlike problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping may be especially helpful when the person has very little control over the situation, such as experiencing the death of a loved one. In these instances, problem-focused coping is unlikely to be of much use because there's very little the person can actually do to change the situation. Emotion and problem-focused coping strategies are not mutually exclusive. That is, people can engage in more than one type of strategy when facing a stressful event. And some actions, such as seeking social support, can serve both purposes. For example, friends and family can provide us with emotional comfort when we face stressful situations. And they can also sometimes help in practical ways too, such as offering guidance or providing financial support. Specifically, according to the buffering hypothesis, social support can act as a kind of buffer that protects against the harmful effects of stress. Moreover, these protective effects are especially evident in high-stress situations. Consistent with this idea, studies have shown that higher levels of social support are associated with a number of positive health outcomes. For example, people with higher levels of social support show better survival rates following breast cancer and better immune system functioning. In fact, people with high levels of social support may even be less likely to catch the common cold. Why is social support so beneficial? Well, there are probably a number of different reasons, but some interesting research has shown that social support can actually have a number of direct positive physical effects on our bodies. Specifically, social support can increase our body's release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that plays a key role in emotional attachment. And oxytocin actually downregulates the HPA axis by inhibiting the release of CRF from the hypothalamus and HCTH from the pituitary gland. Remember that although increased activation of the HPA axis can be helpful in the short term for acute stressors, in the long run, elevated HPA axis activity can have harmful effects on our cardiovascular and immune systems. So in facing chronic stressors, having a good social support system can help minimize these negative consequences by downregulating our HPA axis and cortisol levels. While social support has been shown to be particularly beneficial when coping with stressful situations, especially high-stress situations, other coping strategies may be less helpful or even maladaptive. For example, one type of emotion-focused coping strategy is to simply avoid the stressor altogether. Have you ever had a big exam coming up, but rather than studying, you chose to binge watch Netflix instead? Or maybe like me, you are also really great at simply avoiding any kind of emotional conflict with friends rather than addressing potential issues in the relationship. Although these avoidance strategies might provide temporary relief from feelings of anxiety, they are unlikely to be helpful in the long run because they undermine actually dealing with the problem at hand. In this video, I discussed our cognitive and behavioral responses to stressors and how those responses can actually change our physical responses too. For the exam, you should be able to define cognitive appraisal, discuss the processes of primary and secondary appraisal that occur when people encounter a potential stressor, define and distinguish between a challenge versus a threat appraisal and identify each in an example, define and distinguish between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping strategies and identify each in an example, discuss which type of coping strategies might be more versus less effective in different situations, and explain the buffering hypothesis and discuss why social support appears to be so beneficial for both emotional and physical well-being during times of stress.